Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 19. In the earliest chapter of my life, speaking of Wigglesworth, I alluded to the melancholy spectacle of old age down at the heel, which we so often see in New York, the aged remnants of former respectability and vigor, the seedy clothes, the forlorn and half-starved aspect, the lonesome mode of life, when wealth and kindred had alike decayed or deserted. Such thoughts recurred naturally again to my mind as I and the old landlord descended from the hired hack and entered the gates of Trinity Church to pay the last honors to the body of poor Wigglesworth, who, at a heavy cost, had the one engrossing wish to be buried there with his mother. For his family, particularly on the maternal side, was of considerable rank, reduced as the old man had become. May the aged clerk rest in peace there, in that vault in the midst of the clang and hubbub of the mighty city, which surrounds him on all sides. For his was a good nature, and from first to last he had proved my firm friend. I often imagine him, even now that time has mellowed down his appearance. I often imagine him to be again shuffling around, his lips caved in upon a mouth bereft of teeth, his white, thin hair, his bent shoulders, his spectacles, and his dismally warm clothes. Again I say, may he rest in peace there in the venerable churchyard. The better feeling of our times has created ample and tasteful cemeteries at a proper distance from the turmoil of the town. The elegant and somber greenwood, unsurpassed probably in the world for its chaste and appropriately somber beauty, the varied and wooded slopes of the cemetery of the Evergreens, and the elevated and classic simplicity of Cypress Hills, and correct sanitary notions have properly made interments in the city limits illegal, prohibiting them by a fine which is heavy enough to form an effectual bar, except in cases, as occasionally happens even yet, of a strong desire to be buried in a spot hallowed by past associations and the presence of ancestors, with an ability to pay the fine. Still, the few old graveyards that lie in some of the busiest parts of our city are not without their lesson, and a valuable one. On the occasion of the old man's scanty funeral, after the others had departed, and I was left alone, I spent the rest of that pleasant golden forenoon, one of the finest days in our American autumn, wandering slowly through the Trinity graveyard. I felt in the humor, serious without deep sadness, and I went from spot to spot, and sometimes copied the inscriptions. Long, rank grass covered my face. Over me was the verdure, touched with brown, of trees nourished from the decay of the bodies of men. The tombstone nearest me held this inscription: James M. Baldwin, aged 22 years, wounded on Lake Champlain. By the date of the time of his wound, and also that of his death, both of which were given on the stone, I knew that the latter took place about a year after the first. Here, then, lay one of the Republic's faithful children, faithful to death. Was it, for I felt in a musing vein, hard for him to die? Hung round about his prospects a gay-colored future? 22, that was my own age, and of death I shuddered instinctively at the thought, for I felt that life, matter of fact as it was and is in reality, I felt that to me it opened enjoyment and pleasure on every side. I was happy in my friends, happy in having Ephraim and Violet and Tom and Martha and Inez, every one of them. I was happy that I lived in this glorious New York, where, if one goes without activity and enjoyment, it must be his own fault in the main. Truly life is sweet to the young man. Such bounding and swelling capacities for joy reside within him, and such ambitious yearnings. Health and unfettered spirits are his staff and mantle. He learns unthinkingly to love, that glorious privilege of youth. Out of the tiny fractions of his experience, he builds beautiful imaginings, and confidently looks for the future to realize them, and then he is so sure of those future years. Was not, probably, such the spirit of the young man whose grave I now sat on? The shroud and the coffin for him? Alas, so it was ordained. For nearly a year, fever burned his blood, and sharp pains racked him, and then came the dismissal of oblivion. In the northern part of the old graveyard, I found the tombs of a father and mother, natives of New York, with a numerous family of their children. Haply the whole of the chain, unbroken, was there. Various as I saw by the dates were the periods of their dying. They had all been brought here at last, some of them, no doubt, from distant places, and were there mouldering, but together. Human souls are as the dove, which went forth from the ark, and wandered far, and would repose herself at last on no spot save that whence she started. To what purpose has nature given men this instinct to die where they were born? Exists there some subtle sympathy between the thousand mental and physical essences which make up a human being, and the sources wherefrom they are derived? Another inscription I found in the graveyard read thus: Edward Marshall, died 1704. The stone was low and uneven. The words appeared to have been obliterated by time, and then traced out again by some kindly hand. 1704! At the time when these paragraphs are being printed, nearly a century and a half ago. Of the generations then upon the earth, probably not a person is living. What great events have happened, too, since that time? A nation of free men has arisen, outstripping all ever before known in happiness, good government, and real grandeur. And even that star of Corsica, which flitted like a glaring phantom across the world, now lies in no warmer a tomb, splendid as it is in the gay capital of France, than the one covered by that brown and age-decayed slab. Near the wall that divides the yard from Rector Street, I stopped by the grave of a man who, in his time, was the sower of seeds that have brought forth good and evil. The burial stone tells the following story. To the memory of Alexander Hamilton. The Corporation of Trinity Church have erected this monument in testimony of their respect for the patriot of incorruptible integrity, the soldier of approved valor, the statesman of consummate wisdom, whose talents and virtues will be admired by a grateful posterity, long after this marble shall have mouldered into dust. The circumstances of the death of Hamilton, which took place July 12, 1804, are well known. He was 47 years old. On the day of his funeral, the Common Council, the militia, the clergy, the bar, and the Society of the Cincinnati, with a mass of citizens, convened in Park Place, and while dire wishes of vengeance rankled in many a bosom, moved in solemn procession down Broadway to Trinity Church, where Gouverneur Morris mounted a stage and erected in the portico, and delivered a funeral oration. The grief of Hamilton's family, who were present, seemed contagious. Every eye was wet with tears. I may here add that I have, once to twice in my time, met the still living widow of the dead man, a lady whose aged form is constantly busied in works of kindness and benevolence. Nearer to Broadway is a broad, square, simply elegant mausoleum, on the slab of which is graved, "My mother. The trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall rise." A sweet epitaph, and the manifestation of a most sweet motive. In the farther corner of the yard was a ruined tomb, the bricks fallen down, and the whole partly covered by a rough pine shed. But read the history inscribed upon it, "In memory of Captain James Lawrence of the U.S. Navy, who fell on the 1st day of June, 1813, in the 32nd year of his age, in the action between the frigates Chesapeake and Shannon. He had distinguished himself on various occasions, but particularly while commanding the sloop of war Hornet, by capturing and sinking His British Majesty's sloop of war Peacock after a desperate action of 14 minutes. His bravery in action was only equaled by his modesty in triumph and his magnanimity to the vanquished. In private life he was a gentleman of the most generous and endearing qualities, and so acknowledged was his public worth that the whole nation mourned his loss, and the enemy contended with his countrymen who should do him honor. On the opposite side, the heroic commander of the frigate Chesapeake, whose remains are here deposited, with his dying breath expressed his devotion to his country. Neither the fury of the battle, the anguish of a mortal wound, nor the horrors of approaching death, could subdue his gallant spirit. His dying words were, "Don't give up the ship." In the present condition of the church and grounds, the remains of Lawrence have been removed from their distant corner, and now occupy a new and appropriate tomb, close by Broadway, at the immediate left of the lower gate. The foregoing inscription has been transferred literally, and the posts at the corners of the new tomb are formed of cannon planted there. Lawrence, the brave ideal of such as I, of all American young men. What a day must that have been when he drew out of Boston Harbor, and the hearts of his countrymen beat high with the confidence of victory! What a moment when, struck down by the enemy's fire, enveloped in smoke and blood, the sounds and sights of carnage around him on every side, he was borne from the deck, overcome but not conquered, his last thought, his last gasp, given for his country. Taken by generous victors to Halifax, his corpse was treated with those testimonials of illustrious merit which became his exalted courage, and the character of a people never niggard in their administration of true patriotism. But not long could this beloved republic spare the remains of a child so dear to her, and so fit to be a copy for her children. His body was brought to New York, and here the people buried him. Even his nearest friends wept not. Their hearts were not sad, but joyful. The flag he died for wrapped his coffin, and he was lowered in that native earth whose boast is that she has nurtured such brave defenders as himself. Sleep gently, bold sailor, nor let it be thought presumptuous that many a youth of America, wandering near your ashes, feels that he could wish to emulate your devotion to your native land. More and more enamored with these researches, I continued strolling for hours in the old place. Since the settlement of our island, this spot has never been used for any other than religious purposes. Before 1696, there was but one Episcopal church here, and that, until 1740, the time of the Negro plot, when it was burned, stood in the fort, now one of the favorite public grounds, the Battery. In 1696, Trinity was built. In 1737, it was enlarged, and in 1776 it was burned down in the great fire which destroyed 1,000 houses just after the Battle of Brooklyn, the city falling into the hands of the British. In 1788, when the country had become somewhat settled from the Revolution, Trinity Church was rebuilt, its dimensions being 101 feet by 74, a great size for those days. But the immense wealth of the church corporation and the gigantic progress of the city encouraged the officers. It is, when this statement is read not many years ago, to pull down what was not yet an old edifice, and erect the costly and superb pile that certainly forms one of the finest pieces of architecture in the New World. While perusing my meditations, the noon had passed, and the after half of the day crept onward, and it was time for me to close my ramble and move homeward. I put my pencil and the slip of paper on which I had been copying in my pocket, and took one slow and last look around ere I went forth again into the city, and to resume my interest in affairs that lately so crowded upon me. Out there, in the fashionable thoroughfare, how bustling was life, and how jauntily it wandered close along the side of those warnings of its inevitable end. How gay that throng along the walk! Light laughs come from them, and jolly talk. Those groups of well-dressed young men, those merry boys returning from school, clerks going home from their labors, and many a form, too, of female grace and elegance. Could it be that coffins 6 feet below where I stood enclosed the ashes of like young men whose vestments during life had engrossed the same anxious care, and schoolboys and beautiful women? For they, too, were buried here, as well as the aged and infirmed. But onward rolled the broad, bright current, and troubled themselves not yet with gloomy thoughts, and that showed more philosophy in them, perhaps, than such sentimental meditations as any the reader has been perusing. That was Chapter 19 of Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett.